Hi there everyone and welcome to Joe Glass Comics. My name's Joe Glass. I'm a comics writer and creator based in South Wales, and I'm here to tell you all about the comics which I'm loving this past week. First up we have Infinite Frontier from DC, which is by Joshua Williamson Zimanico on the art, with colours by Romulo Fajardo Jr. and Tom Napolitano on the letters. This is a really interesting book. It's like an event book, but without the usual hallmarks of an event book. Like, there aren't 1,000 separate tie-in issues. It's kind of telling its own story quite strongly. It's really, really fun read so far. The art is spectacular. Like, Zimanico's art is just absolutely out of this world amazing. So I'm really excited to see more. And it's also another instance of DC having gay characters up front and center at the lead of this book, which I'm really excited about. Obviously Marvel did it last year with Empire. Now it seems to be DC's turn with Alan Scott and his son Obsidian, who are basically right up the centre and would appear to be going to be playing a major role in whatever is going on here. The really interesting conceit of this is that after the last Crisis event and the last time of DC's universe being rebooted and restarted again, this time it would seem that normal people actually remember it, or at least some normal people are remembering it. This is an idea I've always kind of had in my head as well, sort of wanted to play with. I've just never quite figured out how to do it. So I'm really interested to see where Josh goes with it and how this all will play out, if it becomes a reason for why some people remember their previous existences and others don't. So I'm really intrigued to see what's going on with this particular thing. It's all apparently in aid of setting up a future Crisis event which is going to happen in the DC universe. So I'm intrigued to see how a DC Crisis event looks now under new DC editorial management and everything, because like I say, they certainly have made a really defined and hard push towards representing more people and sort of including some new creators involved in some of their biggest titles. So I'm very interested to see how that will all play out going forward. So yeah, Infinite Frontier was a really fun read with really gorgeous art, so I really recommend that from last week's books to check out. Now, next up, the comics I'm going to read are a bit of a love fest, so some of them might overlap a little. So I'll bring up two to start with, and that would be Sword, number 6, by Alio and Virgil Shiti, Marte Gracia on the colours, and Ariana Maya on the letters. And the other book would be Way of X, issue number 3 by Cy Spurrier, with Bob Quinn on the artwork, Hava Tartaglia on the colour work for this particular issue, Clayton Cole's doing the letters. And it's all part of, obviously, Krakoa and Era's X-Men and the 2 parts of the Hellfire Gala, which is currently running through the month of June in and across all the X-Men line. Starting with Sword, it was really interesting to see how this week the Hellfire Gala X-Men issues were going to follow up after Planet-Sized X-Men's massive, let's say, solar system changing revelations. So yeah, I kind of really was intrigued how this was going to follow up, and boy did it deliver. In fact, if you took my recommendation and checked out Planet-Sized X-Men from last week, I really highly recommend following it up with Sword number 6. You should be reading this series anyway, because it's honestly one of the best things on that Marvel is putting out on the shelves at the moment. It's really interesting because it ties 2 aspects of Marvel's universe together. It's the X-Men line, but also very much the Marvel space sort of line of titles. And given that Al Ewing is sort of doing this book and also Guardians of the Galaxy, they kind of connect really well together. So Guardians of the Galaxy, I'll be discussing that a little later, so a little bit of spoilers, but the other book I'm going to be talking about is going to be Guardians of the Galaxy. Way of X is obviously a really interesting book in that it's sort of exploring kind of aspects of mutant culture. Everyone kind of assumed that it was going to be talking about mutant religion and whether, how they would create their own religion. But it's sort of really becoming more of a series of almost a post-religion culture, and how it's really culture and creating a society that doesn't necessarily require religion, but does require some sort of unifying force. So, and sort of exploring what those could be. So it's like really fascinating to see. It's really playing with some of the interesting elements where people had raised some potential concerns and issues with New Mutant Society's, Krakoan Society's free main laws, particularly the go forth and make more mutants kind of law, which kind of feels a little bit like, well, what if you don't want to have children, blah, blah, blah. And that kind of comes up. So anyone who's ever had those kind of questions, that is covered in Way of X issue 3, so highly recommend checking it out. It's also just involving some of my favourite characters. I mean, obviously you've got Nightcrawler, you've got Pixie, who is a Welsh mutant, so come on, Marvel already, just give me that job already. I need to write that Pixie one-shot. And likewise, Legion, who is another character who I absolutely adore. There's plenty of mysteries in this book, and it's all sort of leading up to a major villain returning. I'm not going to say who they are, because it is technically spoilers if you haven't been reading the series, because we're still kind of early into it. But I highly recommend it, because it's perhaps an interesting and controversial choice of villain. Yeah, it's a villain which I've always particularly liked, because I just think he looks cool. So yeah, this is going to be a really interesting one. I would in fact say, as a whole, the current X-Men line, the Krakoan mutant era, if you will, is really absolutely amazing, and it's very much on a par with classic X-Men by the likes of Claremont, Byrne and Austin. Now, there's been some discussion from a particular creator who's decided to poo-poo on it, which is somewhat unprofessional, if you ask me. You can have those opinions, absolutely, but maybe don't put them out on a platform like that when, you know, these people are your peers and they're sort of working in the same kind of job that you are. So, like, it's maybe a little rude, but given who's expressing them, I'm not entirely surprised. I would say, don't listen to him. If you loved X-Men ever at all, you're gonna love the current X-Men line, because at the end of the day, this is very much soap opera, just like classic X-Men from those eras. Now, anyone who thinks like, oh, those X-Men, they were all action and anything, you clearly weren't reading them, because there was tons of soap opera, and it was why people fell in love with the X-Men line. It's very much, I think, why a lot of manga does so well these days in the market, because manga can often provide a very much soap opera fix, which, frankly, a lot of American comic books just aren't delivering on anymore. But thankfully, the current run in the X-Men titles is really bringing that back in a big way, and it's really much more modern and culturally relevant. And it's also interesting because it's taking the same idea of creating that soap opera and talking about a culture and a minority and everything, which, I'm sorry, Claremont was doing. If you didn't get that when you were reading X-Men in the 80s or 90s, I don't know what to tell you, because that has absolutely always been there. Yeah, diverging somewhat. Updating that sort of discussion to being less a bit of, oh, minorities hated and feared and all that, which, is still a relevant story, unfortunately, so it's still something which we do get bits of it in this, but also much more about, a culture and a community coming together and creating their own world to live in. And yeah, that's really fascinating, and these two books, I think in particular, Sword and Way of X, are really exploring that in a big way, so I highly recommend them. So if you haven't been reading them, get to your local comic shop, ask them to put it on your pull list right away, because honestly, these are amazing. As I said earlier, Guardians of the Galaxy issue number 15, which is Legacy number 177, is the other title which I'm going to be raving about this week. So it's a bit Marvel heavy, but it's been a bit of a Marvel heavy week for me. It is again Al Ewing doing the writing on this, with Jan Frigeri on the art and Federico Blee with Cory Petit on letters. It is really awesome. I've always been sort of more of a dipping in and out of the Marvel sort of space line of titles, kind of just when stories need to sort of get to a point where I really like. And frankly, Guardians of the Galaxy at the moment is definitely up there in the stories I really like. It's really awesome as well, but it's very queer heavy book. A lot of the characters are LGBTQ. This particular issue ties in to Sword 6 in a big way. I would say if you were to get the pair of them, read this title before you read Sword issue 6. Though technically they kind of overlap slightly. It's a really interesting look in unifying the Marvel Universe, because like I said, the X-Men line, as great as it has been almost doing its own thing for a lot of what's been put out. There have been connections here and there, like mini-series which involve other characters, etc., but it's very much kind of been focusing on the mutant side of the Marvel Universe, as it were. And books like this, Sword and things like that, really sort of making the connections now, making it part of the wider Marvel Universe. So it's really interesting to see how these connect and play out. There is a sort of final page reveal in this issue of the big bad of an upcoming event through the Marvel Space line of books, which, honest to God, I did not see coming. Like, I've been trying to think for a little while, like, who this character was going to be, and this is unexpected. In fact, I would say that it looks like Marvel Space Line may wind up connecting to another aspect of the Marvel Universe soon, and I'm going to be really interested to see how exactly that plays out. Al Ewing is once again proving to be a master at what he does, in that he's involving a lot of classic and long time ago stories to really add colour and sort of depth to the stories that he's telling now without being bogged down in that kind of continuity. So it really is completely accessible to a new reader, but also feeling like there's actually weight to what is happening here. So yeah, those were my big selections this week, so I really do recommend checking them out. I'm going to put a link in the description below so you can find them digitally and also your local comic shop so that you can go buy them. I would say check them out. I think there's a lot of fun things coming from Marvel and DC in the very near future, and a lot of things being set up, so I'm really excited to see where the big two superhero comics are going. Again, I can't recommend the X-Men line enough. It really is superb, and everyone in the X-Office should be absolutely proud of themselves for doing an absolutely tremendous job, and they should always remember that and maybe not listen to the haters. Well, anyway, that's going to be a quick info burst for this week. I'm Joe Glass. You've been watching Joe Glass Comics to find out everything I love about comic books. I'm going to head off and have myself a nice cold drink because it's an incredibly warm day today. So yes, thank you once again for checking out the channel. Please like the video and subscribe for all future video updates. And please remember to have a happy Pride.